the McAlvany Weekly Commentary, covering monetary, economic, and geopolitical news events. Now, here are Kevin Orrick and David McAlvany.
Why are some countries so rich and others so poor?
Kevin, our guest today, Hernando de Soto, says that the answer to that question is amazingly simple, yet controversial.
Yeah, so controversial, in fact, that Hernando de Soto has been the target of terrorist bombings, assassination attempts. His car even one time was machine gunned. His message is clear. It may just be the most important economic message of the 21st century. Welcome to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick, along with David McAlvany, and today we're joined by Hernando de Soto in Lima, Peru. Hernando, why are some countries so rich and others so poor?
Well, basically, some countries have the tools that are required to organize wealth. That is mainly the United States, Canada, ergo North America, Western Europe, and a few Asian economic tigers like, say, Japan. What these countries have got are property rights, which basically allows everybody to identify their assets, and business organizations, which allow you to pull together these assets and combine them. If you look around your room, there isn't one thing that's been done by one person. Wherever you are, we could even be in a hut in Tanzania, there isn't one thing that's been built by one person. Everything requires cooperation. And cooperation requires essentially two things. Two things to be identified: who is where, who owns what is what. Those are property rights. And the second is, how can I cooperate with people around me? Now, interestingly, when you go to developing countries in the former Soviet Union, and you start taking down the following statistics, which is who has got property rights and who has access to the tools of a modern company or a corporation, you find out that less than 10% of people do. And that's it. So the countries that are prosperous are the countries where people are allowed to come together and be able to identify each other even though they may live miles away. I mean, I don't need to know you personally if I've got a property rights system, because I can find out who you are through the books, through certificates, through registers, through record-keeping systems. I can track you. And in most countries in the world, you don't have that. So until you don't have that, there's no possibility of creating wealth in any significant manner.
One of the things that struck me, Hernando, reading your book was something that we take so for granted here in the West, something that we take for granted here in America. We just assume property rights are just something that we assume it almost like the sun coming up in the morning. I'm not sure what the percentage is exactly of the world that really doesn't have recognizable property rights.
You're making the American example, and the taking for granted is a good starting point, because it wasn't always that way. You, the United States, were a third world country too, back in the 19th century, and that's not so far ago. Take, for example, California. California used to belong to Mexico, and they found a lot of gold. So in came the gold rush. That began in 1948. By about 1856, you had over 3 million North Americans that had divided up California into 800 mining claims under no law whatsoever except their own. Okay, that's the third world today. It took you about 50 years to put all of this in the books and create Schwarzenegger's state, which today has a gross national product that is equivalent to all of Latin America. But, 120 years ago, it wasn't that clear. So you created a system of property rights where everybody could access assets and exploit them and organize them just a few years ago, and that made you go from being a very poor country, or a relatively poor country, which the United States was at that time, to becoming the richest country in the world.
Well, it seems that other countries are somewhere in the same process that we went through 50, 100, even 200 years ago. Is there something that accelerated that process in the West?
Well, the things that accelerated that process in the West were, on the one hand, migration. That is to say, lots of people coming into more or less the same geographical location, and therefore they've got to settle the issue of who owns what. That happened, of course, in North America, and it happened all throughout Western Europe. As the feudal system and the systems of kings broke down, that kind of a social order, that vertical social order, which was no longer possible as more cottage industries began emancipating from the feudal order, brought the need for a new order. And once it took hold someplace, that place became so rich that another country that was a neighboring country had to follow, and so on. What's happened in the developing countries, of course, is that these large migrations that we're talking towards large cities where a lot of people get conglomerated and the tribal or feudal systems break down has been taking place over the last 50 years. So I'm not too sure the phenomenon that we're now seeing in developing countries and former Soviet Union countries could have even occurred before half a century ago. And as people are now coming around the cities and as people are finding new ways to organize themselves, then comes the issue of how do you get their property rights in the books? Because as people come, for example, from the hinterland in Nigeria towards Lagos, the capital, or say you're in Tanzania and you're people moving towards Dar es Salaam, or you're in Mexico and people are moving towards any of the big cities, Mexico City, Cuernavaca, wherever, as these people group around that city, they're no longer doing it really as tribes or communes, they're doing it as individuals. And then they begin making arrangements between individuals, which is what your gold rushers, mining claimants were doing, and that immediately raises the issue of property rights. In other words, there's a new social contract whereby it is no longer the collectivity, that is to say, a group as a whole that owns the assets, but it's individuals. And the moment individuals own different things, and they have to relate to each other to be able to deal with them, buy them, sell them, rent them, combine them in whatever form it is, then these countries really need a legal system of property rights so as to make a new social contract. That's where we are in most places, in most parts of what is today developing countries and the former Soviet Union. It's a process in which China is also very much involved at this time.
Now, it seems like there is a status quo that would be defended by the propertied elite. They may be a part of a formal system or not, but by having established a certain measure of control and dominance in the market, why would they want the common man to be integrated into the system? I think that's basically what we have in Russia. You don't have the larger population participating in this sort of growth, massive growth of wealth. It really is just in the hands of the few, just in the hands of the elite. How do you get past someone defending the status quo?
Well, the way to do that, and the way we do it in every country that we're called to perform our activities, which consist principally of getting the numbers in, is to get the statistics. The statistics will indicate that any system whereby only a few people own something and the rest don't is extremely unstable. Those who are on the outside looking in just won't take it. Which is why, for example, when you get a situation like a country of Venezuela, and the reason Hugo Chavez comes in is because most of the people feel left out. One of the reasons that you're getting in, the world of 21st century modern globalization, a president like the one you've got in Ecuador, who's going against the businessmen and the elite, is because those who were on the outside voted him in. And the same thing happens with the president of Bolivia. They're voting them in, and you get this all throughout the Middle East. So once the wealthy, those that have some of the advantages, actually get the numbers in, there's no way that they will stick to the status quo if they understand that the status quo will eventually mean that their demise is coming, that they will be expropriated one way or another. So at the end, interestingly enough, it's not so much the elites that oppose it, it's the fact that creating a property system requires a certain methodology. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to isolate it from other problems that exist, religious or otherwise. So at the end, we find out that the elites themselves will agree to giving people property rights. Let me give you an example, just Latin America, where I live. Any Latin American elite, whether you're living in Rio de Janeiro and looking at the hills that surround you, or you're living in Lima and looking at the mountains that surround you, or you're in Bogota and also looking at the mountains that surround you, or even in Mexico City, all those mountains, anybody who's visited us will see that they're full of shanty towns. So the poor, those that don't have assets, are taking them by force anyhow. The question is, why should they take them by force? Why shouldn't we create a legal system where they can buy them and get them on credit and access them the way you allowed them to do in the United States throughout the 19th century? So in other words, the problem sometimes is not so much that the